By the time the rest of the students arrived in a wave of shouting and chatter and no doubt already a miscast spell or 5, Severus had made himself at home in the first-year dormitory. Well, not at home per se, but he had arranged it to his liking as much as he could, which in his experience amounted to the same thing. To begin with, he had taken one look at the long rectangular room with its tall windows on one side looking out into the dark depths of the Black Lake, and moved his trunk from the first bed right next to the door to the last one, all the way near the alcove in the back. No way was he going to spend another 7 years having everyone bother him and stroll right into his space whenever they pleased. He had put an end to that as soon as he could the last time around, but it had taken time and hard work, both to gain the other boys' respect and to figure out and learn the right spells. Not just to punish, but also to make sure that they would not pass by any closer than they absolutely had to when leaving the room, often followed by accidentally stumbling over his locked and out-of-the-way trunk, which had all of his finished homework inside. I only wanted to take a peek and compare sources his arse. There had been a reason a young Severus Snape had started creating his own spells, and it was not only because he had limited access to the ones he was interested in and the unfortunate luck to be born the same year as Potter and Black. Not that any of that would happen again this time. He was well capable of keeping even the most obnoxious of school children out of his space if he wanted, and there would be no excuse to walk any further into the room than their own beds or the ones of their stupid little friends. There was no hope of them actually doing that, instead of being nosy brats, of course. But thinking of something a talented first year would believably be able to pull off in revenge was at least a pleasant little mental diversion. He sat back down on his bed, not quite nonchalantly, because Severus was never that, but as if he hadn't just spent the last few minutes casting minor repelling and darkening charms on the entire back area. Any subtlety would of course be lost on the brats, but being caught with his wand out before he'd even had his first lesson would lead to questions, which was something he wanted to avoid. There would already be more than he wanted, considering his vanishing act at the start of term feast, but when weighed against having a more private sleeping space for he wasn't even willing to think how long, then some minor annoyances tonight would definitely be worth it. Better than fighting children for his preferred bed, at least, which would have been low even for him, and also the Gryffindor thing to do. There was a loud crash out in the corridor, followed by a furious shout. Really, Slytherins were supposed to be the quiet, sneaky ones. Oh well. At least there was one good thing about no longer being seen as an adult by his house. Whatever mayhem they were causing, whoever's nose had been turned upside down, it wasn't his problem anymore. No teachers would come to him to complain about anyone's behavior, and even better, no whiny first years or spoiled spawns of former Death Eater colleagues would bother him expecting to be coddled. As if a head of house was a substitute parent, and not just there to make sure they weren't a complete embarrassment to their house. The door banged open, and a cursing figure barged in, face twisted in both triumph and disgust. Ah yes, the welcome committee. How utterly unsurprising. Severus closed his eyes and begged Salazar for strength and patience. He should have known Lucius would send the hounds rather than lift a finger and actually do any prefect duties that didn't include lording over everyone else and delegating the legwork. A pity. Talking to his old friend in private would have been a lot more effective. Found him, the figure yelled back out into the corridor, then cracked its knuckles. I heard we'd gotten sullied with a baby mudblood. However did you get in here, you worthless piece of filth? Severus sighed. Naturally, something like this had to happen sooner or later, and Severus guessed it was wise to get it over with as long as the entire house was still more or less assembled. But he would have preferred if he'd been fetched to explain himself by someone he hadn't spent the last year of his previous life trying not to hex into oblivion. Someone who was now nothing but a stupid, powerless child. He was not going to take out his wand. Instead, he got up and slowly made his way to the door, never taking his eyes off the cursing boy blocking the way. No doubt word had gotten around by now about the newest and least respectable addition to Slytherin, and how said addition had disappeared halfway through the feast. The prefects, led by Lucius, had to be quite annoyed at that once they'd noticed that was, not because of his parentage or appearance, but because losing a new student on the first night of term was an utter embarrassment. And Slughorn would be far from pleased at the loss of face should he have to inform the other teachers and call for a search. He doubted that they'd told him yet, though. Matters were always handled in-house first, and while Slughorn had the unfortunate tendency to coddle the well-connected and talented, there was no chance the self-absorbed wannabe potions master would have noticed if one of his ducklings had gone missing without being told, especially one which hadn't caught his attention yet. Unsurprising, Severus sneered, taking in the half-grown visage of his former deputy. You look far too inbred to grasp the concept of doors. Of course, given present company, that might not actually be understood to be an insult. His tone, however, very much was. Why, you dirty mudblood. It was the first day of term, he told himself. Far too soon to use an unknown jinx on the idiot and langlock him. He might have done many despicable things in his life, but he'd never cursed or cast any spells on children once he'd become an adult and been in a position of power over them, no matter how much they'd have deserved it, not that he was any more, or that there was any chance of that lasting. But he would at least try to be somewhat believable. For now. Another head poked in, this one entirely unfamiliar, although given the badge on his chest it had to either be the 5th or 6th year prefect. You did? Well, then you better get going. Malfoy does not like to be kept waiting. The interruption was not welcome, but Amicus Carroll also knew his place in the Slytherin hierarchy, knowledge which he mostly used for kicking down the ladder, and with another equally uncreative slur lowered his fist. He hadn't even drawn his wand. What an absolute waste of magic. The prefect ignored Carrow and smirked at Severus. You're in trouble, kid. Malfoy thought you'd gotten lost. Had to call for a search. Severus looked at him blankly. And you couldn't have used magic for that. I thought this was a school for wizards. The prefect now, too, looked as if he wanted to join Carrow in his cursing, but before he could properly react, Severus had already slid right past the both of them. The common room when he arrived was almost completely filled with students chatting, playing and generally making a nuisance of themselves. Only a few of the older years were absent, probably busy looking for him. How unfortunate for them. The rest of the first years were all there, relieved at having been sorted into their family's house, gawking and being congratulated by their siblings and other extended relatives, as if they hadn't all heard endless descriptions of the Slytherin common room and its underwater windows before, which were too dark to see through right now anyway, so there was no need to poke them. Admittedly, the first time Severus had entered the common room at 2 had been with an embarrassing amount of awe and amazement. Mostly at the expensive-looking tapestries and chandeliers, as well as the elaborately carved fireplace and surrounding leather sofas. There had even been a chess table. Not a table with a chessboard on top, but an entire table made just for playing chess. Overwhelmed by all the other wondrous new impressions, it had been the one thing a young Severus Snape had latched onto. He had always known that his family was poor. Of course he had oranges were for rich people, his mother had always said, and meat on Sundays for the middle class. And anyway, there was nothing wrong with porridge and potatoes, but it had been that small, seemingly extravagant luxury which had really driven it home, that, and not the fact that he was the only one in his house wearing ill-fitting second-hand robes. He hadn't even noticed the underwater windows. By now he had long grown out of any wonder, and only sneered at anyone who thought that wealth made them any better or smarter or worthier than the rest of wizard kind. Nor did he blink at even the most ostentatious displays of wealth. Almost 20 years of being considered a close friend and confidante of Lucius Malfoy did that to you. speaking of. There, in front of the fireplace, in a high-backed armchair surrounded by the sons and daughters of the richest and most ancient of pure bloods throned this year's 7th year prefect, is Long. White blonde hair brushed to perfection and his silken robes artfully arranged so that his badge gleamed in the flickering firelight. Probably the entire house had been relieved that neither he nor his female counterpart had been made head boy or girl, for that would for sure have made Lucius even more unbearable. At least he hadn't discovered his fondness for albino peacocks, yet those pampered abominations were loud, making noise at the most atrocious times of the day and walking the gardens wherever they pleased. Worst of all, Lucius had never allowed any silencing spells to be cast on them. Severus stepped forward, a sarcastic remark on his lips, when Lucius turned his head and they both caught sight of each other. Severus did not stop or hesitate. He hadn't when he'd seen the other man disheveled and aged beyond his years, wondrously cowering at his master's feet, a servant in his own home, and he was not going to do so now. Lucius was an arrogant, glory-seeking peacock who only cared about himself and his family and who possessed the kind of wealth and family name which allowed him to get away with anything, a fact which Lucius was both well aware and never hesitated to make use of. No, Severus never felt sorry for anyone, and he was not going to start for the likes of him. He did, however, swallow. The boy in front of him looked so young, practically a child, thinking the world of himself, sure, but also an oblivious, overly sheltered teen not even fully grown into himself yet, glowing with health and self-assuredness. And while his features might have been a bit softer than those of his son, he also looked an uncomfortable amount like how Draco should have looked these past few years instead of the whimpering, constantly afraid shadow he'd become. Now, if that wasn't a thought to quickly swallow down and ignore. Lucius beckoned him over with a proud wave of his hand, curiously taking in the 11-year-old Severus in all his unwashed, sallow-skinned, patched-up glory. The way he had looked before Lucius had dragged him to his tailor and told him that just because he insisted on eschewing silk and colors and baths didn't mean that he had to shame his lord and Lucius' dinner parties by dressing in rags. Severus had let Lucius pay for 3 pairs of severe black robes and all the warming and protective charms on offer the billowing charm he had added himself later, and then proceeded to ruin the mood at the next dinner party, and thanks by eviscerating everyone's intelligence and magical prowess. That had been the early days, of course, back when Severus had still been incapable of saying no to the offer of free food, no matter how little he actually cared for it. A habit which he'd thankfully grown out of by the time he joined the Hogwarts staff and was regularly invited to tea by Albus and his assorted collection of inedible sweets. This was not that Lucius. No, this was a Lucius Malfoy Severus had long since forgotten. Lucius the student, the one who had been his first ever friend apart from Lily, who had protected him, no matter how self-serving the motivation. Ah, the last of our new first years, Kami said, clearly not approving of what he saw, but all the more intrigued. There was no doubt in his voice that he would be obeyed. Of course there wasn't, Severus thought. He was going to indulge him, though it was going to make his life a lot easier in the long run, if grudgingly. Now, what's your name? What's yours? Severus fired back, unable to help himself. Lucius raised an eyebrow, surprised. Clearly no one had ever not known who he was. My name is Lucius Malfoy, and I am the 7th year prefect, he said. Then, doubtfully, you do know what a prefect is, don't you? Severus rolled his eyes. He'd probably be doing that for the rest of his life. Yes. Lucius nodded in approval, as if he were a pet which had at long last succeeded at preforming a trick. Severus did not point out that Muggles had prefects as well, and had them long before wizard kind. His gaze, however, remained expectant. What was he waiting for? Ah, yes, his name. Minerva had announced it loud and clear for the entire hall to hear, so there was really no need to ask, but a certain level of manners were apparently expected. Severus' own repertoire of manners was very selective and limited to anything he didn't find an absolute waste of time. But he was willing to make some concessions for old friendship's sake. Severus Snape. Not too many, though. Just because this was a younger version of his old friend, one whose approval would make his acceptance into Slytherin go a lot smoother and quicker, did not mean he couldn't hate everything about this entire situation. And where are you from? There were advantages to being thought half feral and mud-raised. Cokeworth. Cokeworth was the kind of factory town which had only begun to grow into more than a hamlet with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and which was thus entirely unworthy to be taken note of by the upper echelons of wizarding society. That's in the Midlands. He didn't care about any of their approval, he just wanted to be left alone. My father is a muggle. Best to get it over and done with. Lucius frowned. And who is your mother? Severus shrugged. Severus shrugged. A witch. Lucius Malfoy was not amused. Severus thought he ought to be grateful he was bothering with any of this at all, and not just hexing everyone. Once Severus had been very interested and eager to learn more about his magical heritage, had insisted he be called a half-blood and not a mudblood, to show that he belonged. This had been then. She never talks about her family. Probably a mudblood then came from somewhere to the side. Had Severus still been a teacher, he'd have begun to despair of everyone's vocabulary, not because of the slur, but because they lacked any and all creativity. At least they were able to focus their attention on something, though, even if it was on something as meaningless as someone's parentage. Not that it was meaningless here. And yet here I am, Severus said, glaring at everyone. I wonder what qualities the hat saw in me that made up for my lack of inbreeding. Lucius laughed. He was the only one. Luckily, he was also the only one whose reaction mattered right now. There were advantages to being so wealthy and pure-blooded that even your peers thought you overprivileged. Severus smirked. He had chosen his words carefully there. He did, after all, know Lucius, who wasn't all that hard to figure out. He had also asked him once years ago why he'd given him a chance, had patted him on the back and let him sit with him and his friends after his sorting, instead of immediately writing Severus off after noticing both his general appearance and the lack of connections his last name implied. It was easy to overlook that the other man-boy could be quite cunning and smart when he wanted to be. It just so happened that he could also afford to be very selective in how and why he wanted to use his mind, and mostly was. Fortunately for Severus, in either life, Lucius had chosen to use said not entirely worthless mind when Severus had been sorted, and had concluded that he had to be hiding quite a bit of talent, or at least ambition, in order to make up for his lack of breeding. Simple answer, which had nevertheless taken most of the other Slytherins months to figure out. So do I. Lucius smiled. It was not a nice smile, but it was reassuring. A lifetime ago, after being sorted, Severus had beelined to the empty place next to Lucius at the Slytherin table, something which no other and better informed first year had dared. Severus might not yet have been aware of the power the Malfoy name carried, but he had seen the prefect badge and the way the older boy held himself, and if he'd learned anything from his father, it was to always aim for the head, something which Severus still considered true, and not just metaphorically. He had been rewarded by having Lucius be the first one to actively welcome him to Slytherin House, and he was well aware that his time in Hogwarts, and especially in Slytherin, would have turned out a lot different if the 7th year prefect hadn't taken the ill-mannered. Impoverished half-blood under his wing, and openly approved of his presence in the house from the very beginning. He had, of course, no interest in cultivating the same semi-dependent relationship they'd once had while still at Hogwarts, with Severus grateful that he had at least one powerful older student in his corner who recognized his potential and did not look at him in disgust, even had he wanted to. He doubted he could have, as it could never be the same. Lucius Malfoy might not be the young child Lily was, but he was still very much an overindulged and coddled teenager, and not the man who had, despite everything over the decades, remained one of his closest acquaintances. That didn't mean that it wouldn't make his life a lot easier if he got on Lucius' good side, and so that was what he would do. Play if not nice, then at least interesting. Lucius leaned forward. Especially as said qualities seemed to include finding your way to your dormitory without being shown the way. Ah, so Lucius had noticed that he'd left alone and before everyone else. Severus blinked and did his best to appear innocent. He was going to miss their relationship. Having someone with half a brain to sometimes talk to was not unwelcome, especially when said person served brandy instead of lemon drops and was not mostly insane. But then again, their relationship had only really grown into one of somewhat equals years after graduation, so there was nothing really to miss. Why wouldn't I be able to find it? My mother did go to Hogwarts, you know. Lucius snorted. And naturally you managed to find your way to the Slytherin common room just from her tales alone. Severus nodded, face expressionless. Naturally. Around them chatter had long since started up again. If it had ever stopped, he probably had to thank Black for that. Him being sorted into Gryffindor was quite the scandal after all. Much more so than a random kid with a Muggle last name being sorted into Slytherin, something which not actually the entire house cared about. Lucius cocked his head, calculating amusement in his eyes. Right, children were stupid. Other first years probably really did need to be shown the way, despite having heard countless tales from older siblings and relatives. And I assume it was also her who told you the password to the blank stretch of wall that marks the entrance to our common room. Of what? There had been no password. The door had just slid aside as it always did ever since he'd become a teacher, and with it Slytherin's head of house. What he repeated, not having to fake his confusion. There was no password. Apparently he had spent so long looking down at everyone's idiocy that he'd begun to overlook his own. He hadn't even considered he'd need a password, he hadn't in so long, and it'd always been the prefect's job to deal with those. He cursed himself silently. Clearly he'd grown too complacent over the last half year. No stupid child would have made that mistake. And then, because he was good at compartmentalizing and could will himself to shelve his breakdown until later, quickly added, the door was open. Maybe it was that poltergeist Peeves. Lucius looked doubtful. Severus widened his eyes and attempted his best ignorant first-year impression. Too bad he had spent a lifetime honing the exact opposite temperament. Scowling and sneering at everyone was just so much easier.